So yeah, so Dr. Yoni, you have the floor, and you may share your screen for the presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. And I want to pick up on what was just said about different religions and different backgrounds and how do we find that coherence. And that's what I'm going to present on today. Let me share my screen. I have screen sharing is disabled.
Yes, just 1 second. I'll try to get that sorted.
Okay. So what I want to talk about is the role, the impact of values and culture on multilateralism, and that we need to go a little deeper in how we approach it if we're going to really get to a more substantive results of multilateralism. I still have that I'm not able to share the screen.
Just 1 second, please, because we're having like a few technical problems. Just give me 1 second.
Okay. So the name of my talk is The Impact of Values and Culture on Multilateralism. And I want to start just really with a definition of multilateralism, which is when 3 or more parties are participating, especially governments or different countries are participating in a process. And it means multilateralism means having members or contributors from several different groups, especially different countries working together. And multilateralism necessarily means multiculturalism. So I'm just sharing my screen now. Okay, can everyone see it? Yeah. Go into presentation mode. So multicultural means multilateral. And multilateralism implies that there's collaboration among different cultures. And also what's usually overlooked is that every multilateral table has its own culture. And the problems arise because that unique culture of multilateral groups themselves, the table itself, is rarely accounted for. On top of that, there's no coherent, and I'm going to emphasize that word because that's really what I'm talking about today, is bringing coherence of accountancy. And there's no way to account for the impact of the differences in worldviews that are at the table. And so a lot of multilateral processes lead to frustration. People feel blindsided by things that weren't in their culture, but they're facing it from another culture, but they have no way of compartmentalizing that or understanding it. Also, there's a lot of rhetoric for higher ideals, visionary aspirations that are not just rhetoric, but deeply discerned, but they're not grounded in inclusive data. And so they remain sort of over here, somewhere else, other than what we're trying to do. And there's no coherent platform for accounting for shared vision and for mutual interest, for finding out exactly where do we already agree, for ensuring that action steps track with the needs and the desires of constituents, because there's no coherent platform for understanding what constituents need and how that tracks with what's going on at the table. There's also very little means for tracking progress on multilateral agreements and positions that move beyond specific actions. And also there's so much incongruence with the charter, with the SDGs, with culture of peace, the Declaration of Human Rights, because we're not doing database tracking. And so that track remains kind of understood as fuzzy and something over there and other than what's going on at the table. Nothing could be further from the truth. Those things are seminal, but we have to find a way of bringing them into the processes. And so what happens is processes get derailed by very superficial focus on actions and agreements at superficial levels, and issues get superficially defined. And so then we find ourselves managing those same issues over and over and over again. Hard time getting there we go. So it works like this. most things are happening at this level: strategy, goals, actions, those kinds of things. But we forget about what's really holding those up: values, culture, the intangibles. And that's really what I want to talk about today, is this metaphysical. Metaphysical is the study of causality. It's the science and the philosophy of what causes what. And so until we deal with these deeper things going on, we're never really going to be able, it's just going to be luck if any action really makes big changes in the long run. And when we ignore this is when you get accidents in boating, and wherever. You can't ignore, the main, most of the iceberg is below the surface and can't be seen. And I would put the point forward today that most of the issues at any multilateral table are pretty much in the same place. The ones that are really clear and outlined in the agendas are on the top of the iceberg. So the result is that differences end up getting compounded and alignments end up getting overlooked, while nationalistic positions get locked in. And there's nowhere to go because all they've got is that kind of superficial ideas. And then that leaves multilateral actors stuck. They're stuck assuming a lot, which is really a hard position to be in when you're just working on assumptions. The assumption is that we all want the same thing. Of course we do. Everybody wants good stuff to happen, peace on earth. But there's a lot of assumptions that go in that. There's a lot of ways that different people express their values, and that's according to their needs. And what multilateral actors also end up conjecturing a lot about what their own stakeholders want, about what those on the other side are really about. And that conjecture is so dangerous. And there's not much else to fall back on, really, frankly, often. And they're also not able to factor in cultural differences in a meaningful way, because the deeper mechanisms of cooperation are overlooked and they're usually unaccounted for. And there's often authentic alignments that are already in place, that are there, but people are unaware of them. And so they don't build on the foundations that are truly there for them. And ideas like we the peoples from the UN Charter and other noble ideas end up remaining abstract. They can't be accounted for. And it's really unclear what that means to people, what fulfillment would look like. And so we get ideas about peace that look like this graphic on the right, which are important. They're all solidarity, nonviolence. All these words are really important, but there's no framework for accounting for them over time, or for really recognizing how they fit into any given process. And so what I want to show you today is cultural transformation tools that measure values in order to quantify culture. And what they do is they establish a platform for multilateral coherence. So they give a specifics around identity, purpose, and vision, and we can lay them next to each other. We can see both sides of saying, this is your purpose and vision, this is ours. Where do they connect and how? And I'll show you more about the particulars of that in a minute. It clarifies divergences in underlying needs and priorities. If you know that before you even come to the table, that really lets you hit the ground running. It's a great jumping off place. It also identifies coherence for enacting on the 2030 agenda, and it establishes that coherence across the UN, across member states, NGOs. It gives one coherent platform for understanding these things. And it provides an overarching inclusive framework for understanding and prioritizing everyone's needs and desires. And this gives a mechanism for recognizing nationalistic issues, but also transcending them at the same time. So you get the both and when you start working at the level of values and culture. And it also, by using a database platform, you get a baseline for tracking progress. And the tools that I'm ready to show you, the cultural transformation tools, have been used to transform cultures of over 7,000 organizations in 80 countries, and they've been used at the national level for 24 countries and for hundreds of government agencies. So this is what these do. They move from this kind of word salad and high aspirations to data-based accountancy. And I'll go into this particular case in a bit, but this was an Indigenous community in Australia that was really suffering with gang problems, drug problems, and some of the worst societal problems that we see all over. And these were some of the results they got by just quantifying what was going on. We look at what are people's personal values, what do they see happening in the current culture, and what do they all want? So here you start to get a shared vision that everyone's weighed into inclusively in the algorithms, in the data. They're already included. It's not about certain people coming up with a vision and then trying to, by hook, line, and sinker, bring people on. Either they have enough charisma or clout or bullying abilities to bring people on. You find out what is it that the people want, and then you work toward that. So measuring values to quantify culture is a means of effective means, because values connect the dots between visionary language and what's going on in the ground. Values connect the intangible with the tangible, and they are the expression of our ethics, which is where these higher level mandates come from, like the UN Charter, the Declaration of Human Rights. These are expressions of ethics. So values are the building blocks of culture. And when you have shared values, you have trust. Where there's shared values, you have a sense of community, because there is a sense of cohesion and you have that sense of unity. And cultural values are the framework within which every member of a culture operates. Culture is determined by the values, the beliefs, and the behaviors that underpin the policies, systems, and structures of any collective entity. See, when you start just trying to do the policies, systems, and structures up here, and you're ignoring all of this, you're just working on shaky ground. So culture determines what is and what is not socially accommodated. So if what's being built down here accommodates disparity, accommodates violence, then that's what's going to grow on the top. I think it's a little bit easier to think of it in terms of culture as a nutrient. Trying to get rid of this. And culture as a nutrient, like if you have culture in a lab dish, it grows some things and it doesn't grow other things. And so that's what we want to think of and quantify and account for, is what are our cultures growing? And when you're at a multilateral table, what do both cultures sustain naturally by purview of just what they are? And until you measure and quantify what they are, that's just a guessing game. That's all conjecture. So the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace, which I'm going to lean heavily on, is culture is a set of values, attitudes, tradition, modes of behavior, and ways of life. And they link mind and culture. They link the tangible with the intangible. UNESCO's motto is building peace in the minds of men and women, because that's where it has to happen first, and yet we never account for that. And values are those intangible mechanisms for making that link between what's in our minds and what's showing up. And they are also mechanisms for establishing alignment among multilateral stakeholders, and also for quantifying what are the non-alignments, where do we have the work to do, and where can we jump off from because we're already connected and agreeing. So values are supplied to people by their cultures, and they're accepted by people as their cultures. They unite groups and communities, they generate and support actions, and they transcend beliefs that divide. So in other words, if I'm really disagreeing with someone and I find out that they're really only saying what they're saying because they want to have time with their family, or they're not pushing me aside, but they're valuing their family, I can let go of my position a little bit and say, well, yeah, I can relate to that. My family's important too. So let's get on the page about that. Most importantly about values is they are primal human drivers. And according to twin studies, there are more important drivers in our behavior than even genetics. And they are drivers across all kinds of things. I put a copy of my book here because I have a huge references in the end that cite all of these studies. What we know is that when values develop, cultures transform. And values develop by way of maturation, education, dialogue, exposure to other countries and cultures, by tragedies, by leadership decisions. And when our values start to develop, we get new ideas, new traditions, new norms. And so by looking at the other values of the stakeholders at a multilateral table, we can start to transcend our own form of values to understand where they're coming from, what's going on. Minds and cultures transform in accordance with values development. So that automatically means that we've got to account for values and culture in multilateral processes as a means of accounting for deeper, more intangible elements of success. Accounting for values is accounting for culture. Accounting for shared and divergent values supports multilateralism by articulating foundational, deep, intangible drivers of results. They articulate at the level of causality. And until we get there, it's going to be hard to keep thinking that all of these wonderful projects that happen in the world are really going to take us to where we need to be. Accounting for culture supports multilateralism by factoring in the roles of those drivers. So here's how we do it. We basically, Richard Barrett many years ago took Maslow's hierarchy of needs and translated that into something that we could start to use to quantify these things, because values ultimately reflect needs. At the first level, you have survival. You know, at the place of a company or a country, you want to make sure everybody's fed, that people are housed, that people are safe. And then you want to make sure that people are getting along, that things are happening in a social way, that best practices are happening, that we're looking at becoming better, that we're really tightening up and growing, and that we're making a difference in the world, and that ultimately we want that universal greatest good that's spelled out in all these documents. So here's just I'm not going to go through all this, but this is just a sense of how this is laid out. We can work with it at a personal, organizational, or community or society, national level. And this is where the coherence comes in. We can take these measures at any place and work with them around each other and against and with each other. So I want to call your attention to these red words here. And these are what we call limiting values or potentially limiting values, and they lead to entropy or drained energy. So what we get, at level 3, where we have self-esteem, like best practices and efficiency and excellence, things like bureaucracy can show up, confusion, complacency. At level 2, you can get people manipulated, blamed, competition. At the national level, you get intolerance, hatred, discrimination, loneliness, and isolation. In the first level is where you get corruption and things like that. Corruption is the #1 corollary with violence in the world by peace studies. And so, if you don't manage that at the deeper levels, time has told us, history has told us, we have had phenomenal programs around nonviolence, and yet still violence plagues us because we're not managing it at the deeper levels. And when we do manage it at the deeper levels, we just kind of go, oh my God, that's too fluffy and too fuzzy, I can't really go there. But it's not fluffy or fuzzy at all, because we can quantify these things now. We just have to have the will to do that. So what we know is that social and economic performance is optimized by alignment between individual and cultural values. Contrary to cultural mythology, it does not happen by the triumph of one over the other. And that's part of what's going on at multilateral tables, is people are still buying into this idea that if I get over on you, I will win this process. And that's just a really faulty ground for multilateral success. And there's also old cultural mythology that has been proven just very recently, that this idea of survival of the fittest is true, but it's only true if you include the capacity for cooperation as a measurement of fitness. Because once we get above very, very simple organisms, it's cooperation that says whether or not they're going to survive, not domination. And when you have non-alignment around values, that hampers fulfillment of whatever mission or agreements are there. We call that entropy. Entropy is the amount of energy that's consumed in doing unnecessary or unproductive work, in talking about what's wrong, that example Dan used of, someone making a great statement and then talking about what's wrong with everybody else. So that's entropy. That's time not going toward adding value to what's going on and the needs at hand. And at the end of the day, entropy is a measure of the fear, the conflict, the friction, and the frustration that's preventing people from getting their needs met, and that causes systemic and that causes multilateral breakdown. So you can see, at this little graphic here that values, and when you start to get these negative or limiting values, you start to get imbalance, you start to get just energy drain. Just think about in your own organization, if people are around the coffee pot, when we used to be around coffee pots together, and they're complaining about the organization, complaining about the boss, upset about how things, can't get the information. At the UN, we see a lot of silo mentality as an entropy point. And so when you're on an elevator with somebody, and because of rank and hierarchy and all those things, you can't pass on a piece of information or get a piece of information, that's entropy. So values can be developed and measured, and that would support multilateral work at a deep fundamental level. It would do it with inclusivity that is rarely there at multilateral tables. It does it with transparency. It provides the coherence, and we can do these cross-culturally by laying these tools on top of each other. So using values-driven database tools establishes coherence in transmitting and enacting all of these things across UN, member states, NGOs, private sector. It enables values fulfillment to drive policy making and practice, which is what the charter is asking us to do. We just haven't had a means, or we've had the means, we haven't deployed the means to do that. And it provides an inclusive basis for dialogue that enables multilateral actors to just hit the ground running, because we already know the landscape. So I just want to use this as an example here, because this is what I showed you before. When we deploy these, we looked at who are people, what do they really want, what's going on here. And these hollow dots are the entropy points. They're saying there's blame, there's confusion, there's caution, there's control, there's information hoarding, which we also have had come up at the UN. Exploitation, these kinds of things going on are weakening the culture. They're hard to build on. What do they want? The group wisdom, and this is what I love about these tools, is you can mine the group wisdom. You're not guessing as a leader, you're actually representing what the group has said. And this is what they want. And we have a way of looking at values jumps. Actually, I can show you that quickly. Values jumps, we can track them. Here we can track like currently there's this is Asheville, this was a community one, but just to show you how we can track the difference. Currently they have 8 people say there's accountability going on. 159 people want more accountability. What a great place to start in building a community. They know what they want, they've already said. And there's the hit the ground running option that can really support a multilateral process. So we can also track how these things work with sustainability, with specific SDGs. So at the end of the day, this community of Indigenous people not only had all these changes as a result of taking the assessment and using it as a jumping off place for, you could say, even though it was within one community, the gangs were at the table, the healthcare people were at the table, the governance people were at the table. So it was a multilateral table in that sense. So again, these are kind of the 7 levels of where this all fits in, to just reorient you as we go into more. So the link between the SDGs and values is something that's newer in our work. Knowing that we value what we need, the SDGs are ultimately the expression of humanity's needs. And the UN definition of sustainable development is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future, basically. And so when we look at these 7 levels, we start to be able to discern, how do we get to, how do we connect these intangibles with the more tangible targets and goals of the SDGs. And we have these laid out very specifically in the backdrop algorithms for these. We also did some work on delineating culture of peace values and connecting those with SDGs and with these 7 levels. So we can actually get a readout on how aligned is any specific culture with having a culture of peace, and universally and within. So the objectives can also be put out in the 5 Ps: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. It's another lens of looking at these things. Because we want to create conditions for every human being on Earth now and in the future to have the opportunity to experience health, happiness, and peace. That's kind of ultimately what we're all doing here, is we want to live in harmony, and we're trying to break that down in a way that we can really account for it. So if you look at it from the 5P perspective, we can look at the personal, private, and public sectors in terms of how they fall into the 5Ps. And these are graphics that we can put out that are specific to whichever parties that we're measuring. So we could do one for each of the parties at the multilateral table, as well as one for the culture of the multilateral table itself. And I want to tell you more about the national assessments, because when we dig into those, they'll show you a little bit more about how these things connect with each other. What they do is they provide a means for listening to constituencies and establishing coherence across constituencies. They highlight the most important national community issues, and they provide a roadmap, and they identify issues, and we can create demographics. So we see subgroups, we can see what do gender differences mean in these different countries, or at the different stakeholder organizations on a multilateral table. How are ethnicities different? And it enables people to participate. It's really participatory at the end of the day. So this is a list of up to date of all the countries that we've assessed and the years that we've done the assessments. And I just want to go quickly through and give you a sense of what's been done. So this is a generic breakout, and it just shows you that here's what people think individually in this anonymous country. Here's what people are facing: unemployment, bureaucracy. Here's what they want. They want, this level 4 is transformation. They want to transform. They want things to change and get better. They see that, and you often see that in these. The people will tell you what needs to be done, and there's a lot for someone whose job it is to sit at a multilateral table to really know that, and not to be guessing or conjecturing about it. So this is the UAE. It was measured in 2012. It gives you a sense of, strong culture in its own way, how it wants to develop. Just to tell you, entropy among nations is the dysfunction that occurs due to a felt presence of unmet needs or fear. And it really shows like potentially limiting. So here's Australia from 2016. You see a lot of potentially limiting values and where they want to go. You can see they want a lot of level 1 work. They want bottom line accountability, and if that's what you really want to see is a full spectrum. You want to see like a full, these dots kind of spread out between all the different parts. Here's Australia done over time. In 2010, here's where they were. In 2016, here's where they were. There hasn't been a lot of progress, as you can see. There hasn't been much change, but at least it's accounted for. Brazil over time from 2010 to 2017, also a lot of problems. They have a lot of violence. They have some issues with governance right now that really speak to violence and some of these issues that the population identified. South Africa also really riddled with its own issues of entropy. And these are just the top 10 values. So there are a lot of other positive values that I'm sure came through, but they're not there. They don't show up in the top 10. And people will tell you what they want: accountability. They want honesty. They want employment opportunities. These are the things they want their representatives to work toward. So France, they did over many years. This is from 2012 to 2014, 2015 to 2017. You can see not a lot of progress, and in fact, some regression in what they're doing. Iceland, they were done right before the crash. And when Richard Barrett did it, he said, if I saw a country like this, I would think that they were going to just crash completely. And when he got on the plane, they did. Saudi Arabia, Bhutan, which does all the happiness and well-being work and actually measures for these things through its own indices, which, by the way, this is not the only index out there to do this. There are other tools. This is just one that I wanted to go a little more deeply with today and open this distinction of accounting for these things. Singapore over time, Turkey, no progress. Here's the USA over time. Again, no progress, and look where we are. Singapore, and here's the percentage of entropy by nations. So I think this is really interesting. Where you see the most entropy is where you see the most struggle. So you quantifying and measuring values and culture, you can see exactly data-based what is the culture of each constituency at the table, the culture of the multilateral group itself, what the different demographics want, and how they're already aligned, how they differ, how those differences should be addressed, and what the differences are within and between multilateral interests. And that identifies common and divergent concerns for future development. And it provides a really detailed roadmap as well as common scaffolding. And it also outlines, you can see when you lay these together, how one culture can transfer values to another. I just want to show you this because this was the Democrat and Republican parties that we were shocked when the results came through on this. There was only one value difference. Imagine if the conversation started here in the US of how much alignment there is. And then, you know, this is the jumping off point for trying to find connection. So we can lay these kinds of things, the different demographics together. These might be two genders. These might be two income strata. These might be two different countries. Depending on, you know, what we're measuring, and then we see what are the actual differences. You can see group A, there's an awful lot of energy down here at these lower levels that probably wants to burst through, because that's part of the human spirit, the human condition, is it wants to expand, it wants to grow, and so usually there is this desire to uplift, and group B already has some intelligence and some work going toward that, and so there's some work that can be done. Group A is obviously really strong at this performance level, and so there's something they can contribute. Here's a different of the current culture. Here's how these two, there's a lot of graphs and charts that come out about these. So that was the current culture of those two groups. Here's a desired culture. This says, here's where we both want to go to get, and these are the differences of where we want to go, and these are the alignments around where we want to go. So when you use these platforms, you can track intangibles and including perceptions, and you can track fulfillment of the UN's values and other visionary global mandates. You can identify very specific alignments, and you know, that naturally supports negotiations when they get challenging. You have a strong bedrock to fall back on. These maps and graphs and charts also plot out the gaps and the blind spots and the leading edges around processes, and they show where entropy is depleting the process. And when you can name the entropy, it's really powerful. You can manage it much quicker. And it clarifies what people's actual priorities are. It tracks the cultural alignment of the member states and international agencies with local desires and needs over time, and in coherence with specific multilateral aspirations, culture of peace indicators, and SDG progress. It allows a coherent system for establishing common scaffolding, for identifying, supporting, and tracking shared interests across nations and other sectors. And with that, I will stop my screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoni. You really presented a completely different perspective of what I personally perceive, for example, of what multilateralism is and how we can work on improving it. Definitely, I personally have never looked at it from this perspective, and it was really educational. So I really thank you for this wonderful presentation.